talked about Richard Upchurch II, a colonial American Upchurch ancestor. We label that as part one, and because there was so much material, we return to you now with part two. And just a brief recap on what we said in part one, Richard Upchurch II was born in 1725 in Brunswick County, North Carolina, Brunswick County, Virginia, and married there about 1750 and began to have children. And then in a few years he moved to North Carolina, where we found him on the tax rolls in 1755. Now he moved to what we call a very large county of Granville County, but we don't know where in that large county he was. We're ready now to move on and talk about a purchase of a piece of land which is very significant and will require considerable analysis. We take this description of this land from Bell West's book on page 27, and it reads as follows. In 1769, Richard Upchurch bought 200 acres of land in that section of Granville County, which had become Butte County in 1764. It was described as being on the south side of Crooked Creek, next to the Womack line and to the Honeycutt line, and it was bought from Lodwick Alford of Warren County, North Carolina, and it appears in the Butte County records, which are now in Warren County, North Carolina Courthouse. It was recorded in the courthouse on the 6th of January, 1770, in Book 2, page 281. Now, the fact that he bought this land in 1769 is not necessarily a precise date. It is a date in history that we have recorded, where we know from prior experience that sometimes acquisitions took place a number of years before. So it's entirely possible that that's where Richard Upchurch II was when he was on the tax rolls in 1755, but we don't know for sure. Now, let's refresh our memory about where we found ourselves in North Carolina with Richard Upchurch II early on. And we'll look at the Dunn County map, and a very brief look at that. We'll show you Dunn Township in Franklin County, North Carolina, and the yellow portion of that is where we think that we know that Richard Upchurch II eventually lived. But in the meantime, we need to think about a much more general map about where he fits in the this large area of land. Now, this is fundamental to all Upchurch history, because one half of the family traces back to this area, and as we begin to cite particular transactions and dates and circumstances and neighbors, we will need to look at this detailed map over and over again. And let's now turn to what I call a much more detailed map. And this map shown here has many colors on it. It's very busy, and so I'll have to take a little time to explain what all this means. I've shown the yellow line running from the bottom to the top of the page, more or less running south to north. And to the left of that we have more or less Harris County Township. And to the right of that yellow line we have Dunn Township. You'll notice that the places are colored in orange, and that there's a red line that runs across the southern part, which I'll have to explain in more detail. The green parts are where Upchurch's own land, we know for sure. The blue represents streams. Now, here comes a tie back into the 200 acres, which Richard Upchurch II bought in 1769. It is said in the deed that this was on the south side of Crooked Creek. Now let's start at the top of our map with a really bold blue line which represents the Tar River. And just below that you see another longish line running all the way from the left of the map to the right, a stream called Crooked Creek, and it runs into the Tar River on the far right hand side of this map. Now you recall that the deed said that the 200 acres was on the south side of Crooked Creek, but note that this particular location is considerably further north than the green spots where we show Upchurch land that for sure existed at later dates. Now what we don't know is whether or not he owned this 200 acres only for a short time, or if it was really a little bit of a different situation, because information has come to us that perhaps this would have been not on Crooked Creek itself, but land on Little Crooked Creek. To confuse the matter further, it is said that Norris Creek, which you see in the blue line there below Crooked Creek, might at one point in time have been called Little Crooked Creek. So now that brings us much closer to what we know as later Upchurch holdings. And I have to leave you with this puzzle as something we have to work out. And I do this unabashed and unshamedly because we all have to understand that in our heritage there are puzzling factors that have to be worked out, and somebody has to dig deep and keep figuring out what the real answer is. In the meantime, we will assert for sure that our ancestor Richard Upchurch II owned 200 acres of land, which he bought with Lodwick Alford, and that Lodwick Alford had gotten this through a land grant. So we do have some background records. Furthermore, the Upchurches have ever since been associated with Lodwick Alford and his descendants. Even in recent years, I've been in close contact with many descendants of the Alford Association, and we have many interests in common, including those that unfolded in Franklin County. Now you'll see other streams there as well. To the right, there's one that originates in Franklin County but crosses the border line. That happens to be Turkey Creek, and I mention that as importance because one of Richard Upchurch's second sons, Benjamin Upchurch, got a 200-acre land grant which touched upon Turkey Creek. So we know that it's over on that side of the county, and that's that one green spot you see to the further right area, which is just above the little town of Pilot, which you see highlighted in yellow. Now let's take for a moment to talk about that red line which runs from left to right. That is a very confusing situation because the land where our Upchurches lived for the most part was below that red line. And that red line originates because that was the dividing line between two large counties that were created in 1746, namely Granville County to the north of that line and Johnson County to the south. Now, in the south area then, this area was in Johnson County from 1746 until 1771. So if you were looking for Upchurch records that occurred from 1746 to 1771 below that red line, you would look in Johnson County. Now, when Wake County was formed in 1771, they just took a part of Johnson County, which included this particular part here, and it was in Wake County. And it stayed in Wake County until 1787, at which time it was transferred to Franklin. So you can see the Upchurch land there below that red line could have been first in Johnson, and then in Wake, and then in Franklin, with the person owning the land never moving. Now, to the north of that red line, also peculiar things happened because the land to the sort of east of the main part of Granville County fell into Butte County as of 1764. And Butte County existed then for some 15 years until 1779, and all of the eastern part of old Granville County would have been Butte County. So if an Upchurch acquired land between 1764 and 1779 north of that red line, that land would be in Butte County. But then in 1779, that particular Butte County was divided into two counties, the northern part becoming Warren County and the southern part Franklin County. So you see, we have to do a lot of head scratching to figure out where a given piece of land would be. We call this area south of the red line as or at least I call it, the high ground triangle, because it is a triangle of land that kept switching back and forth. And if you visit that country, you will see it is more or less the high ground. So I've called it the high ground triangle. And you could in fact look that up in the Upchurch Bulletin, where in volume 8, number 2, in April 1987, that subject is pursued in considerable detail. Now, there are more aspects about this map that we need to pay attention to. The fact is, I have visited this area many times, from the time we lived in Arizona from 1975 to 1995, and from the time we lived in Missouri from 1995 to the present. And when I go to North Carolina, I always make a beeline for going to Dunn's Township and to walk these lands one more time. And every time I learn something special. I'll always recall my first visit, which was there in the 1970s. And as I wandered around the community, I encountered an elderly gentleman by the name of Claude Pierce Sr. And I fell to chatting with him about his heritage in that area. He'd lived there all of his life. And he immediately confessed that he was an Upchurch descendant. In fact, he pulled from his pocketbook a newspaper clipping which traced his family back to a very early Upchurch by the name of Susan Upchurch. Now, I confess we have never figured out exactly who Susan Upchurch was, but I'm pretty sure she was a daughter of Benjamin Upchurch, who was the son of Richard Upchurch, about whom we talked. But this Claude Pierce took me around to different places, took me to his home to dig out more records, and I shall always remember his kindness and regret his passing. Now, another individual that I still visit often, who is a wonderful person to tell you about family history, is an individual by the name of Simon Rogers. Now, he puts me in mind of the gentleman in My Fair Lady by the name of Doolittle, who is classed as being the original philosopher. And I nominate Simon Rogers to be the original philosopher of North Carolina. He's never married, but he has a great deal of knowledge in his head about history of eastern North Carolina, in particular of the Upchurches. As a matter of fact, Simon owns a portion of land that was owned by Moses Upchurch, a son of Richard Upchurch II, which was sold by Moses in about 1803 when he was leaving Franklin County to move to Chatham County, North Carolina. And in fact, this piece of land is represented by the green area on this map on the left-hand side. And we always enjoy going there and meeting with Simon and looking at his land. And Simon, being the charming gentleman he is, will somehow have mysteriously appear something that holds peach brandy. Now, he has his morals, because I will recall on one occasion when he did have the peach brandy in his truck, but when we parted, we were sitting on church property and he would not offer us a swig of this peach brandy because we were on church property. So much for my Doolittle reference. Now, you see on this map other entities like Perry's Pond. That has a huge amount of history, and Upchurch history is attached to it. If you look at that large green stripe on the left, you will be amazed when I tell you that for years I'd heard about an old Upchurch cemetery. And in fact, we were able to find that in due course, and there was one stone there bearing the date of 1833. And we are sure that is the burial place of James Upchurch, who was a stalwart member of the family in that community back in the early 1800s. Now, this map is one we will have to return to time and time again. The Upchurches were very prominent here, and their presence is still there. I can go and visit in the homes of Upchurches that exist there today. The surrounding areas are also important. If we look to the left of the yellow line, Harris Township is one that Upchurches frequently lived in. And to cite a personal note, if you look just to the top right-hand corner, just above the Tar River, you'll see a lake known as Sagamore Lake. And I will tell you that in that general vicinity, my wife was born, and that her grandfather is buried on the shores of that lake in the Sledge Cemetery. That was a notable historic family in that community, which is a different township north of the Tar River called Cypress Township. So now we come down to the closing story, and before we give you the final word, I want to let you know that we have had great success in finding one piece of Upchurch land that is actually documented. And I refer you to the Upchurch Bulletin in October of 1992, and I will show you here the map of some Upchurch land. And this is on what is called State Road 1103, which runs from Pilot in Franklin County over to the western edge of Dunn's Township. And that road passes through land that we know was owned by Richard Upchurch III, the son of the Richard Upchurch II of whom we speak. And that this actual 180 acres of land you see plotted there fits exactly with what was drawn out as an allocation to his 8 children when he died in 1817. If we add to that 180 acres, the 90 acres of dower land that went to his wife, it comes up to 270. And you will notice in the bottom right-hand corner of this is a little addition. This is land sold to Nathan Upchurch I by Richard Upchurch II about 1794. This is a 100-acre tract of land, and this is one tract we know that was definitely owned by Richard Upchurch II. So we had great success in ferreting out this particular batch of Upchurch land, and I hope we can do more like that. So the story is that we have hundreds of citations about the Upchurches in the Moccasin Creek enclave, which lay on both sides of Moccasin Creek in Franklin and Wake counties. We have a lot of challenges to figure out everything that is done there. For example, Richard Upchurch II and Richard Upchurch III, his son, both overlapped for about a 30-year period. And often in the records, when we see a Richard Upchurch who has signed a deed or witnessed a document, we can't tell for sure whether it was the father or son. We will continue to pursue that in some aggressiveness, and we hope to bring you much more detail on the 11 children of Richard Upchurch II. There's a great deal of information yet to present, and we look forward to having more parts on this particular individual, Richard Upchurch II, a colonial Upchurch ancestor.
Thank you.